Hey guys, ready for the next lesson? So in this one, we are going to be looking at evidence of evolution and common ancestry. Okay. Okay. So the idea here is, what are these evidences that we use to support this idea, and how does that kind of connect? So the reality is that we really have a lot of evidence that supports this theory of evolution. But remember, that's taking it back to this concept of things changing over time. So when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about things changing over time. And we have a lot of evidence that shows how organisms have changed over time. The primary sources of these evidences are the fossil record. So we actually go back and we look at what kind of fossils have we found and how do they seem to connect. Comparative morphology, so we can actually look at living organisms and look at what's similar about them, what's different about them. Biogeography, where they live and where they may have come in contact. We look a lot at plate tectonics and how the plates have moved in terms of why do we find certain organisms in certain areas. Okay, so we're going to start with the fossil record. So fossils are remains or traces of past organisms. So here you can see down at the bottom we have pictures of a lot of different organisms. Now, the thing you have to remember is that not all organisms turn into fossils. And so we only get fossils for those organisms who ended up in just the right situation and conditions to leave these remains. So that means that the fossil record is actually giving us a visual record of evolutionary change over time. So we can find different types of these organisms and see kind of how they've shifted and changed. Fossils can be dated by examining the rate of carbon-14 decay and the age of the rocks where the fossils were found. So we actually kind of date approximately how old these are, and that's how we can build this timeline or this fossil record. Additionally, this also gives us some geographical data for the organism where they're found. So when we're looking at these fossils, we're also looking at where are they found, especially if we're comparing them to organisms that exist today. Are they found in similar areas? Are they found in different areas? Were those areas ever connected? These are things that we would need to connect. So when we talk about these different lines of evidence, understand that we don't ever really look at just one line of evidence. We want to look at all of the evidence lines together to make our decisions and our connections. So then we have comparative morphology. This is an analysis of the structures of living and extinct organisms. So we're going to look at their physical appearance. With this, we have a few key aspects we want to focus on. The first is homology. These are characteristics in related species that have similarities, or even if the function's different. So they might all have a humerus, one of the key arm bones, but they use that humerus for different things, like they might use it to swim or to fly, rather than how we use it, picking and lifting. Within this idea of homology, we also have embryonic homology, because what we have found is that during embryonic development, there's a lot of similarities in the steps. And as a matter of fact, early in the development, sometimes it's very difficult to tell the difference between different organisms because their embryonic development is so similar. We also have within this concept of homology vestigial structures. These are structures that we still have within our system, but they really don't have a use anymore. And sometimes we'll look at this and we can compare it to other organisms that we think there may be a relationship to that they may have the structure and have a use for it. And so we can kind of see that there must be some sort of connection somewhere back in the past between these organisms, and that's the reason that we're seeing these same structures. Our tailbone, our appendix are both considered vestigial structures. I know we've talked about this some in class with some other vestigial characteristics. And the last homology we want to look at is the molecular homology. This one's one that is a little more recent in terms of comparisons as we've learned more and more about DNA and amino acid sequences. And so we actually look at how closely are they related based on the genetic code or the amino acids that make up the organism. And this caused some major shifts when they were working on the Tree of Life, because they found that there were some things that were more closely related than they had thought based on DNA. And then there were some organisms that they felt were closely related. And then when they looked at their genetic sequences, they were very different. So homologous structures, this is probably one of the most common things you'll see where they're showing you multiple limbs from different organisms, but you'll notice that we have the same basic bone structure in all of these different organisms. That suggests that at some point in time, all of these organisms had a common ancestor. And then as we progress, we'll see greater and greater differences as they're moving along and splitting off and splitting off. So arm bones of many species are a really good example of homologous structures. Then we have this idea of convergent evolution. So we have similar adaptations or similar functions from distantly related organisms due to similar environments. So that takes us to what we consider analogous structures. So these are the ones that have the same or similar functions, but they obviously had very different evolutionary origins. They came from different lines that have kind of come together a little bit. So the wings in birds, wings in bats, we're talking about a bird versus a mammal versus, how about the wings in bees? These are insects. Obviously, these did not develop all from at the same time from the same branching. So each of these species has wings, but the wings didn't actually originate from a common ancestor. They developed based on the environments and needs to fit those environments. Structural evidences are what we use to indicate common ancestry for all of our different eukaryotes. So we found that in terms of the fundamental and cellular features, the processes that are conserved. So think about when we were talking just about cells, and a lot of the behaviors and processes and structures and things about cells that it didn't matter if it was a plant or an animal or a fungus or an insect, or most of these things, it really didn't matter. That suggests that at some point there was a common ancestor to all of them. So the membrane-bound organelles would be one of our examples to suggest that this common ancestry. Linear chromosomes. All of the eukaryotic organisms have linear chromosomes. Remember, prokaryotic organisms have circular. We were talking about that when we did some of our DNA practice. But all of our eukaryotes are linear. Having those introns in the genes, remember how we talked about we had those pieces of DNA that didn't code for anything, so we had to cut them out and leave them in the nucleus? That's another example that suggests this idea of common ancestry. The next thing we want to look at is biogeography. This has to do with the distribution of the animals and plants geographically. So we look at these in terms of where do we find these organisms. So are these species on oceanic islands, and do they have some sort of connection or resemblance to mainland species? Could it be that they started on the mainland and then something happened, wind, floods, who knows, and they ended up on these islands where then they were able to adapt and fit onto these environments? Are species on the same continent similar or distinct from species on another continent? In particular, we think about Australia. Australia, almost all of the species that are native to Australia are marsupials. They're the ones with the pouches. And we find a few marsupials. We have a marsupial here in Texas. As a matter of fact, our opossum is a marsupial, but we don't find them many other places. And the other side of that is in New Zealand, we don't really find the native organisms that have a placenta instead of the pouch. So different continents, and so we can look back, and that's where we look back at, like, what about Pangaea? What about some of the other continents that had formed as the plates moved over time? Can we trace these connections or differences based on those movements? Okay, quick review. What type of data provides evidence for evolution? So what are those lines of evidence that we're using? So we have our fossil data, biogeography, and morphology. In terms of natural selection, how can structures become vestigial? So how do they basically lose their usage? So the idea here is that at some point in time they were useful, but due to some sort of mutation, they basically became useless. And so while we still have it conserved over generations, it's not really being selected for or against. If it were selected against, we would have lost it. If it were selected for, we would be using it. But we didn't lose it. That's why it's considered vestigial, because there wasn't really anything pushing it one way or the other. So then we want to put it all together, and we know that populations continue to evolve, even now. The genomes are constantly changing. For example, antibiotic resistance in bacteria. As we've developed newer and newer antibiotics, we start getting more and more bacteria that become resistant to these different antibiotics. Insect resistance to pesticides. The more we use certain pesticides, the more insects we have that are resistant to it, and therefore the pesticides become useless. Pathogens cause emerging or new diseases. Well, obviously, if we've got new diseases coming out in areas where we already had other diseases, that means that they must be mutating, they must be changing to be able to get you sick again. Constant new strains. Okay, so hopefully that helps you out a little bit with this topic, and I will see you for the next video. Bye.